Martha was a simple woman who had spent her whole life in the countryside. She was gentle in nature, kind to her neighbors, and always willing to help those in need. Her days were filled with routine work, cooking warm meals, tending to the garden, taking care of the chickens, and making sure the home felt peaceful for her husband, Henry. Their farm was not big, but it was strong enough to provide for them. To others, it looked like a normal life, quiet and plain, but for Martha, it was filled with love and small joys. She never needed anything more than the safety of her home and the presence of Henry by her side. Henry, her husband, was different in many ways. He was a man of few words with a serious face most of the time. His hands were strong and rough from years of work in the fields, and his back often bent from carrying heavy loads. He had built most of the farm himself with his own 2 hands, and people in the village respected him for his hard work and determination. Even though Henry was strict at times, Martha knew he loved her. His way of showing love was not through words or flowers, but through the effort he put into keeping the family safe and the farm alive. But there was one thing about Henry that always stood out. Behind their house, at the far end of the fields, stood an old wooden barn. Its walls were dark with age, and the roof, though repaired many times, still showed its years. That barn was different from all the other buildings on the farm because Martha was not allowed to enter it. From the very beginning of their marriage, Henry had made it clear, "Martha, you must never go into that barn. That is my place, my work. It is not for you." At first, she thought it was just his way of protecting her from tools or heavy machines. She didn't ask too many questions. But as the years passed and as she grew older, the thought of the barn began to stay in her mind like a quiet whisper. Every morning when she went outside to hang laundry or feed the chickens, she would glance at it. The doors were always locked with a heavy iron lock. Sometimes she would hear faint sounds coming from inside, hammering, scraping, or just the creak of wood being moved. But whenever she asked Henry about it, he would simply shake his head and say, "It's nothing for you to worry about." Martha was not a woman who liked to argue. She trusted her husband even if she didn't understand. Still, curiosity has a way of growing quietly in the heart, like a small seed turning into a tree. On some nights when she could not sleep, she lay awake wondering what might be inside. Was it something dangerous? Was he hiding money or old belongings from his parents, or even secrets from the past? Neighbors sometimes teased her about it. 30 years and you still don't know what's in there? They would laugh. Martha only smiled, but deep inside she did wonder. Despite this secret, their life together was full of steady love. They raised children who played in the fields, climbed trees, and ran barefoot through the grass. When the children were small, they too asked about the barn. Henry would warn them not to go near it. Martha remembered one afternoon when their youngest son tried to peek through a crack in the wood, and Henry's voice had thundered louder than she had ever heard. "Stay away from there." The boy had run back, frightened, and never dared to do it again. Martha often told herself that Henry was a man of privacy, that some things were better left untouched. But in her heart she longed to know the truth. She sometimes dreamed that one day he would open the doors for her, take her inside, and show her something beautiful or meaningful. Yet years went by and that day never came. The barn became more than just a building. It became a symbol of silence between them. When Martha walked by it, she felt like it was holding a story she was never allowed to hear. Still, she respected Henry's wishes. She was loyal, and loyalty meant more to her than curiosity. Even if her heart questioned, her love for him always won. Henry himself never explained why. He was not cruel, and he never raised his hand or shouted at her for asking. He simply repeated the same words, "It is not for you, Martha." And with time, those words became part of their life, like the sound of the rooster at dawn or the smell of fresh bread in the oven. As the years turned into decades, Martha adjusted to this unspoken rule. Her life went on in a rhythm, waking early, preparing breakfast, helping Henry in the fields when he needed her, and in the evenings, sitting together by the fire. She grew older, her hair turning silver, her hands showing the marks of work, and yet the barn stood there locked and silent, holding its mystery like a treasure chest waiting for someone brave enough to open it. Sometimes, when she walked through the fields at sunset, she would pause and look at the barn. The fading light of the sky would fall across its walls, and for a moment it almost seemed alive, like it was calling to her. But she never went closer. She would turn back to the house, reminding herself of her husband's voice, The truth was, Martha loved Henry too much to break his trust. Even when her mind burned with questions, her heart chose obedience. She told herself that every person has secrets, and perhaps the barn was his. If she opened it without permission, she would feel like she was betraying him. So she kept her promise. But deep inside, she did not know that the barn was holding something far greater than she could ever imagine. She did not know that her life would one day change when those doors finally opened. For now, she only knew the weight of silence, the loyalty of love, and the quiet mystery that waited behind the locked door. And so, 35 years passed with Martha living beside the barn but never inside it. Martha's life after her marriage was not filled with luxury or adventure, but it was steady and full of duty. She had always believed that happiness came from serving her family, keeping her home in order, and making sure her husband felt cared for. Every day had a rhythm, and though it was sometimes tiring, she never complained. She would rise before the sun, prepare Henry's breakfast of eggs and bread, and then pack food for him before he went into the fields. Her mornings were spent sweeping, cooking, washing, and making sure the small farm animals were fed. The farm was not large, but it was full of work. There were cows to milk, chickens to gather eggs from, and a vegetable garden that needed tending. Martha poured herself into these tasks with quiet pride. Even though Henry was the one who earned respect from the village as a hard-working farmer, she knew that her own effort kept their home alive. Her children grew up watching her work, and they often helped her with simple chores. But it was Martha who carried the real weight of the household. Her love for Henry was deep, but sometimes she felt the imbalance of their lives. He was the decision-maker, the voice that guided everything on the farm. If he said the fence needed repair, he fixed it. If he said the horse needed to be sold, it was sold. And, of course, if he said the barn was forbidden, then no one entered. Martha accepted this role because in her heart, she believed that love also meant obedience and sacrifice. She had grown up in a time when women were expected to follow their husbands without question. But still, there were moments when her mind wandered. The barn was always there in the background, like a shadow that followed her life. While hanging clothes under the sun, she could see it standing tall in the field. When she walked to the garden, the barn stood like a silent guard behind the crops. And when the children played, she often caught them glancing at it, just as curious as she was. The whispers of neighbors sometimes made her restless. At gatherings, women would ask her in half-joking tones, "Martha, don't you ever wonder what he keeps in there?" Some even teased, "Maybe he's hiding gold, or maybe he has treasures locked away." Others gave her uneasy looks, hinting at things less kind. But Martha always shook her head and smiled politely. "It's his place," she would say. "I respect his wishes." Still, when she returned home, those questions echoed in her mind like tiny bells that refused to stop ringing. Years passed, and her children grew taller. They would run around the barn, laughing and chasing each other, but they never dared to open it. Henry's warning had been clear and sharp. Once, their youngest son, Daniel, had tried to push the door just to see if it would open. Henry's voice had boomed across the yard, "Stay away." The boy had stepped back in fear, and from that day on, none of the children tried again. Martha had felt a sting of guilt watching the fear on her child's face. She had wanted to comfort him, but Henry's sternness left no space for questions. Despite her curiosity, Martha never believed Henry was cruel. He was simply firm, and she trusted that he must have his reasons. But as time went on, she began to notice his health changing. The man who once carried sacks of grain with ease now slowed down, his steps heavier, his breath shorter. Martha worried quietly, though Henry never admitted his weakness. He continued working in the fields and sometimes disappeared into the barn for long hours, locking it carefully behind him. When she asked if he needed help, he only shook his head. "This is mine to do," he said. The barn became more than a secret. It became a wall between them. Martha sometimes wondered if his silence about it was a kind of burden he carried alone. On some nights when Henry sat by the fire, staring into the flames, she caught herself wondering if he was thinking about the barn. She longed to ask him why he guarded it so fiercely, but she was afraid of his answer, or afraid he would give none at all. Then came the day when Henry's health took a sharp turn. The strong farmer she had known for decades became frail. He struggled to rise in the mornings, coughed through the nights, and often needed to rest after only a few minutes of work. Martha became his caretaker, cooking soft foods, giving him warm blankets, and sitting by his side as he weakened. The farm was quiet without his steady hands, and the barn stood there, as mysterious as ever while its keeper faded away. On one of his weaker evenings, Henry called her to his side. His voice was hoarse, but his eyes still carried the same firmness as before. "Martha," he whispered, "promise me something." She leaned closer, her heart heavy. "Promise me you will not open the barn while I live. Wait until I am gone. Only then may you enter." Her breath caught in her chest. Even in his final days, the barn mattered to him more than anything else. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to plead for the truth. But looking into his tired eyes, she saw a mix of love and determination. She could not break him in that moment. So she nodded, her voice soft. "I promise." It was a promise that pressed on her heart like a stone. She felt both love and confusion. Why, after all these years, did he still need to keep it hidden? Yet she loved him too much to refuse. She held his hand and let the silence stand between them one last time. Soon after, Henry's condition worsened. Martha's days were filled with caring for him, whispering prayers and trying to stay strong for the family. Their children visited often, helping where they could, but Martha carried the deepest weight. And all the while the barn stood untouched, its lock unbroken, waiting. When Henry finally passed, Martha was overcome with grief. The house felt empty, and the fields felt too wide for her alone. She missed his presence, his steady voice, even his silence. Yet in the middle of her sorrow, one thought remained in her mind like a flame that refused to die. The barn. She had kept her promise, but now that he was gone, the choice was hers. For 35 years, she had lived with questions. For 35 years, she had obeyed. And now, as a widow standing in the silence of her farm, she knew that one day soon she would walk to that locked door with the key in her hand. But for now, she stood at the window, staring across the yard at the barn. The evening sun painted it in gold, and Martha whispered softly to herself, "What were you hiding, Henry? What did you never want me to see?" The answer was closer than she thought, but her heart was not yet ready to face it. After Henry's death, Martha felt the farm around her grow impossibly large and empty. The familiar rhythm of daily life she had followed for decades suddenly seemed to have lost its meaning. She woke up each morning to the same chores, feeding the chickens, watering the garden, sweeping the floors, and preparing meals. But the joy she once felt had dulled. Henry's absence left a hollow ache that even the busy work of the farm could not fill. The barn loomed at the far edge of the property, unchanged, quiet, and mysterious as ever, its dark walls casting long shadows in the early morning light. For months, Martha avoided the barn. She told herself it was only a building, a structure she had been forbidden to enter for 35 years. But she could not escape the questions it held. Every time she passed by it to fetch water from the well or check on the animals, her eyes lingered on the iron lock, the cracks in the old wood, and the faint gaps where sunlight slipped through. She imagined what might be hidden inside: old tools, farm equipment, or perhaps family heirlooms she had never seen. Sometimes she even imagined Henry, standing in the shadows of the barn, smiling at the thought that she might one day see it. Her children returned more frequently after Henry's passing. They were grown now with families of their own, and each visit carried laughter, stories, and memories of their father. They noticed the silent weight the barn carried over their mother. "Why don't you open it, Mom?" her eldest son James asked one afternoon. "What's in there that Dad wanted to hide from us?" Martha only shook her head gently. "Your father had his reasons," she said. "Some things are meant to remain private." She tried to sound calm and wise, but inside her heart wavered. The curiosity that had been buried for decades now burned brightly. On quiet evenings, when the farm was still and the children had gone back home, Martha would sit by the fire and stare at the barn from a distance. The wind whispered through the fields, carrying the scent of hay and soil. Sometimes she imagined the creak of the barn doors opening, the sound of footsteps on wooden floors, and a light glowing from within. She could almost feel Henry's presence guiding her, yet holding back a secret she was not ready to see. One night, after a long day of tending the animals and preparing meals, Martha sat alone on the porch. The sky was filled with stars and the air was cool against her face. She felt a strange pull toward the barn, stronger than anything she had felt before. It was as if the building itself was calling her. urging her to cross the distance and finally uncover what Henry had hidden. She shivered at the thought but also felt a thrill of anticipation. For decades she had obeyed, endured, and wondered. Now for the first time she considered breaking the silence, stepping into the unknown. Yet fear held her back. What if what she found was disappointing? What if Henry's secret was something sad, or something she could not bear to see? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more dramatic than the last. She imagined dusty boxes, broken furniture, or a pile of old belongings that might remind her of all the years she had not been allowed in the barn. And still the pull remained, growing stronger each day. Martha began preparing herself in small ways. She polished the old brass key that Henry had left behind, testing it in the lock without actually opening the door. She cleaned the area around the barn, sweeping the small steps and brushing the dust from the latch. Each act felt like a ritual, a preparation for the moment when she would finally step inside. The anticipation both excited and terrified her. Every time she touched the key, she imagined the moment it would turn in the lock, the creak of the door as it opened, and the sight that would meet her eyes. The farm felt different now that she was the only one in charge. The animals looked to her for guidance, and the fields depended on her hands. In the mornings, she would walk through the rows of crops, checking for weeds and pests, all the while keeping one eye on the barn. The structure seemed alive, silent but alert, standing as a reminder of Henry's presence even after his death. Martha sometimes whispered to herself, "I wonder what you were hiding, Henry. I wonder what you were waiting for me to see." Neighbors noticed the change in Martha. She had always been quiet and reserved, but now there was a restlessness about her. They would stop by for tea, offering condolences and small gifts, but they also asked about the barn. "Are you going to see what's inside?" they would say, teasing her gently. She would smile, nodding politely, but the truth was she was not yet ready. The weight of 35 years of obedience, love, and mystery pressed heavily on her heart. The barn was not just a building. It was a memory of her husband, a symbol of his trust, and a challenge she had yet to face. One afternoon, a storm rolled in over the farm. Dark clouds gathered, and the wind whipped through the fields, shaking the trees and rattling the windows. Martha felt a sudden urgency. The storm made the air feel alive, and she realized that waiting any longer would not bring her peace. She walked slowly to the barn, her heart pounding. She carried a lantern, though the sky was still bright enough, and the key in her hand felt heavy with meaning. Each step she took toward the old wooden door felt like crossing a bridge between the past and the future. As she reached the barn, she paused. The rain began to fall lightly, pattering on the roof and the walls. Martha placed her hand on the cold, rough wood, feeling the grooves and the texture beneath her fingers. She remembered Henry's voice, hoarse and weak, telling her to wait, promising that the moment would come. And now the moment had arrived. The barn was hers to enter, but the fear of disappointment lingered. She took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. Her hands shook slightly, but the key turned smoothly. The lock clicked, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. She pushed the heavy door, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing across the empty fields. Dust rose in the air, catching the lantern light in small golden specks. The barn smelled of wood, hay, and something faintly sweet, like old memories wrapped in time. Martha's eyes widened as she stepped inside. The interior was larger than she had imagined, with high beams stretching across the ceiling and shelves lining the walls. Every inch of space seemed carefully arranged, almost as if someone had planned it with love and care. She could see tools, wooden furniture, and objects she could not yet identify, all covered in dust but neatly stored. Her heart raced. This was no ordinary barn. It was a space that held intention, history, and perhaps even love. She walked slowly, running her hands along the surfaces, trying to understand what Henry had been doing all these years. Each step brought more discoveries: small boxes tied with string, notes tucked into drawers, and objects that reminded her of family moments long past. She realized that the barn was not a place of secrets meant to hide things from her. It was a place Henry had cared for in silence, preparing for the day she might see it. Martha paused in the center of the barn, overwhelmed by emotion. She thought of all the years she had spent obeying, waiting, and wondering. The barn held the proof of Henry's quiet devotion, a testament to his care and love. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that the mystery was not something to fear but something to treasure. The building that had loomed over her life for decades was now a bridge between the past she had lived and the future she would create. She knew, in that moment, that the barn would change everything. It was not just a place filled with objects. It was filled with memories, intentions, and love that had been hidden for her sake. And as she stood there alone but no longer afraid, Martha felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. The barn was hers, and through it Henry's presence remained, guiding her, comforting her, and finally revealing the depth of his heart. Martha stood in the doorway of the barn, her hand still resting on the cold wooden frame. The lantern in her other hand flickered softly, casting shadows across the walls, revealing the shapes of objects she had never imagined. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the rush of emotions flooding her heart. 35 years of curiosity, obedience, and quiet wonder had led to this moment. She had kept her promise to Henry, but now the barn was open, and the truth waited silently for her inside. As she stepped further into the space, dust rose in small clouds around her feet. The smell of old wood mixed with hay filled her senses. Her eyes moved slowly across the barn, taking in every detail. There were shelves lined with boxes, each tied neatly with string, some labeled in Henry's precise handwriting. There were tools, yes, but there were also objects she could not immediately recognize. Small carved items, delicate handmade pieces, and bundles of cloth folded perfectly. Each item seemed intentional, carefully placed, as though Henry had spent years preparing them not for himself, but for someone he loved deeply. Martha's breath caught when she noticed a row of wooden cribs along one wall. Each one was different, carved with care and painted in soft colors. She recognized the style immediately. It was Henry's handiwork. He had always been a man of few words, but his hands were skilled, able to create things of beauty that she had never truly appreciated until now. She walked slowly past the cribs, her fingers brushing the smooth edges, feeling the love he had poured into them decades before. She realized that these were not just cribs. They were expressions of hope, care, and imagination. Along another wall, Martha saw shelves of small wooden toys. There were miniature chairs, tiny wagons, and delicate animals carved from wood. Each one had been polished to a soft glow despite the layer of dust that had settled over the years. She could see that Henry had been meticulous in his work, sanding every edge, painting every detail. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought about the quiet hours he must have spent here, creating these things in secret, perhaps thinking of the smiles they would bring to his family one day. In one corner, a stack of framed drawings and photographs leaned carefully against the wall. Martha recognized the drawings immediately. They were her children's childhood sketches, preserved and protected as if Henry had wanted to keep their innocence frozen in time. There were photos of birthdays, first steps, and small family gatherings. She ran her fingers over one frame, her heart swelling with both love and sorrow. All these years he had been quietly saving these memories, keeping them safe, building a sanctuary of his own making that reflected everything he valued most in life. Then, in the center of the barn, something caught her attention. A large object was covered with a white sheet, the edges tucked carefully to hide it from view. Martha's hands trembled as she approached it, unsure what she might find beneath. She reached out and gently lifted the sheet. Her breath left her in a sudden rush, and her knees buckled slightly. Underneath was a rocking chair, beautiful and perfectly made, with smooth curves and a polished finish. But it was not just any chair. On the backrest, carefully carved into the wood, were the words, "For Martha, the love of my life." Martha's eyes filled with tears, and she sank to her knees beside the chair. Her hands shook as she traced the carved letters. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. After all these years of being kept from the barn, the mystery, the secret, the fear, it had all led to this moment of revelation. Henry had never wanted to hide anything from her out of malice. He had hidden it to protect it, to prepare it, to give her a gift that would last beyond his own life. Every nail, every stroke of paint, every careful arrangement of objects spoke of love, patience, and thoughtfulness that Martha had never fully understood before. The realization struck her deeply. All those years she had felt curiosity mixed with frustration, longing mixed with obedience, and now the reason became clear. Henry's silence had not been a barrier but a promise that one day she would see the depth of his devotion. The barn was his way of speaking to her across time, leaving behind proof of his love in every corner, in every object, and in the chair that bore her name. Martha slowly stood and walked around the barn again, taking in every detail. The toys, the cribs, the framed drawings, they were all more than objects. They were a testament to Henry's life, his careful attention to the family, and his understanding of the importance of memory and legacy. He had been building this space silently, perhaps thinking that she would never see it, but always hoping that one day she would. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. The barn, once a symbol of mystery and separation, was now a place of connection and revelation. Every step she took within it felt like walking closer to him, closer to understanding, closer to the love that had defined their years together. The ache she had carried for decades, the questions that had never been answered, began to soften. In their place came gratitude and awe at the care her husband had taken to leave something beautiful behind for her. As she examined the barn, Martha realized that it was not just a private space for Henry's creations. It was a sanctuary, a place where the family's past, present, and future could exist together. She imagined her children, her grandchildren, perhaps even future generations walking through the barn and discovering the treasures Henry had left. Each object was a story, a memory, a gift that transcended time. The barn had been a secret, yes, but it was a secret filled with intention, love, and hope. Martha sat in the rocking chair for a moment, letting its smooth motion sway her gently. She thought of Henry, his quiet life of labor and devotion, and she felt a surge of love that made her heart ache with both joy and sorrow. He had not only cared for her while he was alive, but had also provided her with a tangible connection to his presence long after he was gone. In that moment, the barn transformed from a place of mystery into a sanctuary of memory, love, and discovery. She spent hours moving slowly through the barn, touching objects, reading notes, and imagining the effort and thought Henry had put into every piece. She laughed softly at some of the toys, imagining the hours of care he had spent perfecting each detail. She cried quietly at the memories preserved in the photographs and drawings, feeling both the passage of time and the permanence of love. The barn was a bridge between past and present, and for the first time in decades, Martha felt complete understanding of the man she had married and the depth of his heart. By the time the sun had set, the barn glowed softly in the evening light filtering through the windows. Martha finally stood in the center, looking around her. The shadows, the dust, the wooden beams, all of it had been transformed in her mind. What once was a place of mystery and longing had become a place of revelation and gratitude. Every object spoke. Every shadow told a story, and every step she had taken to arrive here felt like a step closer to Henry. Martha knew in her heart that she would never look at the barn the same way again. It was no longer a place of mystery, nor a symbol of exclusion. It was a testament to love, patience, and devotion, a space built in secret to honor her, to preserve family memories, and to leave a legacy of care. And as she knelt once more before the rocking chair, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Henry, I understand now. I see everything you gave me, even in silence." Martha woke the next morning with a different feeling in her heart. For the first time in many months, the weight of grief was lighter. The barn had changed something inside her. The space that once felt like a locked door between her and Henry now felt like a bridge that connected them more than ever. She could still see the rocking chair in her mind with her name carved into it, and she felt Henry's presence as though he were sitting beside her at the breakfast table. She went about her chores as usual, but everything seemed to carry a new meaning. The chickens clucked loudly as she gathered eggs. The garden looked greener than before, and the house, though quiet, no longer felt empty. Henry had left her a gift, not only in the barn but in the understanding that his love was deeper than she had ever realized. For years she had wondered why he kept the barn hidden. Now she knew. It was not about shutting her out, but about preparing something that would outlive him, something that would keep his love alive for her and for the family. That afternoon, Martha decided to invite her children back to the farm. She wanted them to see what their father had done, to share in the legacy he had left behind. When she called them, her voice carried both excitement and calmness. "There is something in the barn I want you to see," she told them. At first, they were surprised. They had grown up knowing the barn was forbidden, a place their father had guarded all his life. But now that he was gone, curiosity filled them, and they promised to come as soon as they could. Within a week, the family gathered. Her children arrived with their spouses and little ones, filling the old house with life and laughter. The grandchildren ran through the yard, chasing each other, their voices ringing across the fields. Martha's heart warmed at the sight. It reminded her of years gone by when her own children were young, their footsteps echoing with the same joy. After dinner, when the evening sun began to dip low, Martha led them toward the barn. The air was thick with anticipation. Her eldest son looked at the locked door, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure, Mother?" he asked gently. Martha smiled, holding up the old brass key. "Your father left this for me. It is time you all saw what he kept here." She turned the key and the heavy door creaked open once again. The children and grandchildren stepped inside, their eyes widening in awe. The lantern light revealed the rows of wooden cribs, the shelves of toys, the framed drawings, and the rocking chair in the center. Silence filled the room at first, the weight of discovery too much to put into words. Then slowly the grandchildren rushed forward, marveling at the toys, picking up the little carved animals, and rocking in the small chairs their grandfather had made decades earlier. Her daughter knelt by one of the cribs, tears brimming in her eyes. "He made all of this?" she whispered. Martha nodded, her own eyes misty. "Every piece. He worked here in secret year after year. He wanted us to have this after he was gone." As they explored, the family began to laugh, cry, and share memories. Each object sparked a story. One of the drawings reminded her son of a summer afternoon spent in the fields. Another toy reminded her daughter of the nights they played together on the porch. Henry's love had been hidden, but now it came alive through the treasures he left behind. The barn became filled with voices, warmth, and life. It no longer felt like a place of mystery. It felt like the heart of the family, beating with love and memory. Martha sat quietly in the rocking chair, watching her children and grandchildren discover the legacy their father and grandfather had built. She felt tears stream down her face, not of sadness but of gratitude. Henry had given her something more precious than gold. He had given her proof that love could live on even after death. As the days went by, the barn took on a new role. Martha decided it would not remain locked again. Instead, it became a place where the family gathered regularly. Her grandchildren played there, filling it with laughter and joy. The cribs and toys, once silent, now carried the sound of life once more. Even the neighbors came by, curious to see what had been hidden all those years. When they stepped inside, they were amazed. They spoke of Henry's skill, his patience, and his quiet way of showing love. "He must have loved you very much, Martha," one neighbor said softly. Martha smiled, her eyes glistening. "Yes, he did. More than I ever knew." The barn became more than just a room filled with wooden furniture and toys. It became a place of inspiration. People who visited left with a renewed sense of what it meant to love, to work quietly for the sake of others, to leave behind something meaningful. Martha found herself at peace knowing that Henry's secret had not been meant to hurt her, but to honor her. On quiet evenings after the family had gone home, Martha would sit alone in the rocking chair. The barn smelled of wood and hay, and the shadows stretched long across the walls. She would close her eyes and imagine Henry there working quietly, his hands moving skillfully over the wood, his mind focused on building something beautiful. She whispered to him sometimes, telling him how grateful she was, how much she loved him, and how she finally understood the depth of his silence. The rocking chair became her favorite place to sit. It was not only a chair, it was a message carved into wood, a reminder that even though Henry was gone, his love remained. Whenever she sat there, she felt him near, as if his hand rested gently on her shoulder. As the years passed, Martha continued to care for the farm, though she grew slower with age. Her children often helped, and the grandchildren loved spending time in the barn. They began calling it Grandfather's House of Memories, a place where stories came alive. On holidays, the family gathered there, filling the barn with decorations, songs, and laughter. Henry's secret creation had become the very center of family life, the heart that beat long after his own had stopped. Martha often thought back to the years when she had walked past the barn, filled with curiosity and confusion. She remembered the nights she had lain awake, wondering why Henry refused to let her in. Now she smiled at the memory. What once had been a mystery was now the greatest gift of her life. She no longer felt regret for the years of waiting, because the moment of revelation had been worth it. One late evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the barn glowed with soft golden light, Martha stood at the door and looked inside. Her family was there, her grandchildren playing, her children talking and laughing. The air filled with warmth. She whispered softly to herself, "You gave us more than we ever dreamed. Henry, your love is still here." And in her heart, she knew the barn would continue to stand, not as a forbidden place, but as a sanctuary of love, devotion, and memory. It was proof that silence could hold more meaning than words, and that true love was often shown not in grand gestures but in quiet, patient acts of care. Martha no longer felt alone, for she carried Henry's love with her always, in the rocking chair, in the toys in the cribs, in every corner of the barn, and most of all, in her heart. The woman who had once been banned from the barn now found her greatest comfort within its walls, and every time she stepped inside, she did not fall to her knees in confusion anymore. Instead, she stood tall, filled with gratitude, knowing that she had been loved more deeply than she ever realized.